a daughter of Ogden and graduated from Ogden High School, and then went on to Notre Dame University, where she got a degree in anthropology and participated as a major scholar at Notre Dame. She then went on to get a law degree at Northwestern University in Chicago. She has law licenses in the District of Columbia and in Illinois. She speaks French, German, and Spanish. She is the executive director of the ACLU of Utah. But that's not why she's here. She's here to talk to us about 10 intense years that she spent working in immigration policy in Washington, D.C. Before she came out here to be the executive director, she held a number of positions, most recently as the director of advocacy for the Lutheran Immigration and Refugee Services in Washington, D.C. And she's been through the immigration mill and really has her ducks in a row on this interesting topic. Now, we've given her 30 minutes to present a 2-week-long course in immigration. I would be remiss if I didn't mention that Cassie Taylor is here. She's the development director for the ACLU of Utah and is a wonderful example of the credibility that Brittney has brought to the organization by bringing extraordinarily qualified people who can elevate the mission of the ACLU. But today she's here, Brittney is here today as the spokesman to help us understand some of the issues regarding immigration and refugees. Brittney.
Thank you, Russ. That was quite a glowing introduction, if I can live up to what you promised. So I decided to break the 2-week-long course, as Russ admitted, into 3 more or less simple topics. The first is just discussing America's relationship with immigrants. We often speak of ourselves as being a nation of immigrants, but our realistic relationship is much more complicated than that. Second, touching on why we have so many immigrants living in the United States who are undocumented. And finally, discussing the humanitarian protections that are available in our country and the legal and moral obligations to those who flee persecution and find themselves in the United States. So first, I'm going to begin with America's history with immigrants. And I heard a speaker once explain that America has a love affair with immigrants in the past. We often have rosy perceptions of the Mayflower, of immigrants arriving in Ellis Island. But if we look at contemporary immigration, our history is full of clashes, confusion, wanting to stem the tide of immigrants in contemporary times. To make sure we're all on the same page, I'm going to just run through a few quick terms that often are misunderstood or have different meanings than you might read about in the newspaper. To begin with, the term alien is the legal definition of a non-citizen. That's found in the Immigration and Nationality Act and our immigration codes. And it at times in our history has been used almost as a derogatory term, but it really is just the legal term for non-citizen. There is a distinction between refugees and asylum seekers. And just to clarify, a refugee from the US perspective is someone who's in another country asking for permission to come in the United States for protection. So the stereotypical example is someone living in a United Nations camp who is seeking to be resettled in the United States as a refugee. An asylum seeker is also someone fleeing persecution and looking for protection, but they are already here. They are in the United States asking to stay here with protection. Someone who's undocumented is someone who lacks current legal status. So that could be someone who arrived as a student, who arrived on a tourist visa, has overstayed that visa, and now finds themselves without status. It could also be someone who arrived by walking over the border with no legal permission to be here. A much larger category is someone who is deportable, and that can include green card holders. It can include people who have current valid permission to be here, but they may have committed a crime to make them deportable. And then finally, there's a program that was begun under the Obama administration called DACA, Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals. This was an executive order that President Obama signed, allowing children who arrived here without permission, so undocumented children who were brought by their parents, to work with permission in the United States. They do not have any other legal status. They're allowed to work, and they are allowed to, for the moment, live without fear of deportation. So now that we have those terms out there, I'm going to get into the meat of it. Historically, our country has had many categories of exclusions. Those have been based on countries of origin or perceived race, sexual orientation or deviation, ideologies. Communism was considered a ground of exclusion for decades in this country. Health. We've probably all heard of someone with tuberculosis being turned away at Ellis Island, denied entry. Up until about a decade ago, it was you were excluded from the United States if you were HIV positive. So there have been health exclusions that have a much more modern feel. Criminal histories continue to be a ground of exclusion, and perhaps given our location, I'll mention that polygamy also has for many years been a ground of exclusion. So just one quick note on Ellis Island. Quotas and numerical limitations on immigrants were not established until 1921. And that was to stem immigration from Southern and Eastern Europe. Until then, it was really kind of a free-for-all, and there was no cap on the number of immigrants. So this is important to remember when you hear someone talking about my ancestors did it the right way. We came legally, everything was above board. There was no limitation on immigration until 1921. A less kind note from our past is also Angel Island, and this is the West Coast's answer to Ellis Island. And Angel Island, which is in San Francisco Bay, between 1910 and 1940, Chinese immigrants were detained and interrogated. This is because the Chinese Exclusion Act barred Chinese laborers from entering the country from 1882 until 1943. And if you were Chinese and you left the United States, you were barred from returning under that same time. So very strict limitations on Chinese immigration. Another quick note from our past is Japanese internment camps. And I chose a photo of Topaz, Utah here to give this more of a local meaning. This is a dark spot on our history. The Supreme Court upheld the practice of interning Japanese citizens as well as US citizens from Japanese ancestors. At the time of this internment practice, Japanese immigrants had been barred for 20 years under a bar that covered anyone from East Asia. Bringing it up to current times, you hear a lot of talk about immigration enforcement being lax, no one enforces the laws. That is not true. There are record numbers of deportations and arrests happening now. Did not start with the current Trump administration. Under President Obama, more individuals were deported than under any other president in US history. More than 2.5 million individuals were deported under President Obama. And that's actually more than the sum of all presidents in the 20th century. So some people refer to President Obama as the deporter-in-chief, and that is not a term that they give to him out of respect. As of now, arrests under President Trump are up 40% from the same time period under President Obama. So we haven't seen the same pace of deportations increasing, but that might just be because folks are working their way through the immigration system. But there has been a huge spike in the number of arrests under President Trump. I wanted to point out that immigration is a civil system, and importantly, that means that there is no right to government-provided counsel in the immigration context. However, the consequences for deportation in some instances are even more grave than the consequences in the criminal context. Some individuals, if deported, truly fear for their life in their country of origin. So it can, in some cases, be a life or death situation, and many people go forward unrepresented because there is no guarantee of government-appointed counsel. Finally, I wanted to mention that we have a massive immigration detention system that many people do not know exists. And this detention system holds about 40,000 individuals a day. With folks cycling through that system, it detains approximately 400,000 people every year at a price of $5 billion a year. So we're spending massive amounts of money to detain people for breaking civil immigration laws facing deportation. And it's not a typo that families are detained. I'll get to that later on. So the second point is, why are so many immigrants undocumented in the US? We have approximately 11 million individuals living in the United States who are undocumented. 66% of these, it's estimated, have lived in the US for more than 10 years. So these are not new arrivals. These are people who have been here, put down roots, own businesses, have families, have strong ties to this country. Half of the 11 million, it is believed, are from Mexico, although the percentage of Mexicans in the undocumented population is declining. And more than 3 million undocumented individuals live with at least one child who is a US citizen. That I included just to clarify what is meant when people talk about mixed status families. It's this notion that you might have one parent who's undocumented, one parent who's a citizen, and a child who's a citizen, or any number of combinations. But it is not common to have just undocumented people and then US citizens. Our immigration system is much more complicated than that. Why? Why do we have so many undocumented people? Why don't they just get their paperwork in order and come out of the shadows? The answer in a nutshell is that there is no line or lawful process for almost all of these individuals. My clients over the years would tell me that if there was any way for them to adjust their status, they would have done it years ago. But for most, there is simply no form to fill out, no line to get into. The lines that do exist can be impossibly long. There is a strong pull of family ties, and we hear this over and over again, where someone keeps returning to the US, maybe after being deported, because they want to rejoin their family. It's not as common these days to have just a single man coming to the US to work. It's much more common to have a mom who's been deported and she has 3 young kids here, and she will do anything to come back to be with her children. And then you have the economic demand for immigrant labor. That is a magnet that draws many people to the United States. Our immigration system is based on 2 main categories. You have family-based immigration and employment-based immigration. Family-based immigration recognizes the importance of family ties, but it is consistently talked about as the first thing to be eliminated. If we want to curtail immigration, let's just cut the family-based system. The reality is that there are waiting lists for some categories of family that are over 20 years long. So US citizens and lawful permanent residents have the ability to petition for their spouses, their young children, their parents, their siblings to join them here in the United States. Certain categories are oversubscribed, and certain countries are oversubscribed. So China, Mexico, the Philippines, they send many, many more immigrants to the US than other countries. And consequently, if you're waiting in line as a family member from one of those countries, you have the longest wait. Many people just can't do it. They don't want to wait 20 years to reunite. They find a way to come here, and they do it outside of the law. This picture is Friendship Park in San Diego, between San Diego and Tijuana. They open that gate once a year so people can hug through the fence. It's the only time that many immigrants are able to touch their loved one because of our immigration laws. Employment-based immigration is the other big category I mentioned, and this is replete with shortcomings as well. There are very few low-skilled visas, meaning that landscapers, farm workers, construction workers, there just aren't visas to allow for the number of jobs that exist to be matched with an open visa. On the opposite end of the employment spectrum, you have what's called high-skilled visas, and I know these are offensive terms, which is why I put them in quotes. High-skilled visas you tend to hear a lot about from the high-tech community. So this is why Google, Facebook, Microsoft, they all have big lobbying presences in DC to try to increase the number of visas that they need to bring over engineers, software technicians from other countries. They're required by law to try to hire first in the United States, and only if they can't fill that job can they seek to hire someone on a visa. Even then, they have more open jobs than they are comfortable with. Just a quick note on who is in the undocumented workforce. 20%, 26% of the undocumented workforce is in farming, and 15% is in construction. And this is why you have groups like the Idaho Dairymen's Association is a giant proponent of immigration reform, because they cannot keep their trusted and beloved employees because they are constantly being deported, because there are not visas for them to work legally on their farms. So what's next? Russ mentioned that I should try to throw out some solutions in my 20 minutes. So this is my attempt. There's been talk about, well, can't we just deport all of these 11 million people and start over and everyone can just go home and come back in the right way? Maybe. The effect of that would be enormous. You would destroy the economy. In many towns and many segments of the economy, there would just be open positions. There's actually a documentary called A Day Without Mexicans that shows lawnmowers just running down the street and children without diapers running in the opposite direction of the street. It's funny, but it actually is a reality that if we were to deport an entire segment of our workforce, our economy would take a hit. You would also have families who were devastated, who would lose a breadwinner, who would lose both parents. We have clients who come to us asking, how do I set up a guardianship in Utah? I'm afraid I'm going to be deported and I want my neighbor to care for my children. How do I set up a power of attorney so that my cousin can sell my car if I get deported? It's something that undocumented people think about every day. There has been efforts to advocate for legal pathways, and some have come very close. We had an immigration reform bill that passed the Senate, but Speaker Boehner never brought it up for a vote in the House. So there's a compromise that can be reached. There is a political appetite to try to fix the system. There is agreement on all sides that it does not work in its current situation, but it is so politically fraught. And for the time being, you have 11 million people living in limbo, and those are the undocumented people. That 11 million number does not count their children's or their parents or their bosses. So the impact on this is just exponential. The last piece I wanted to mention is the humanitarian protections. We're living in what's often talked about as an era of fear, an era of hatred towards immigrants. And I included an article in this slide that mentions a refugee ship idling off the Florida coast. Many of us may have heard about the USS St Louis, which was a luxury liner that left Nazi Germany in 1939 with over 900 Jewish men, women, and children aboard. It was going to Havana, Cuba. Everyone had an entry permit, but Cuba changed their laws a few weeks before the ship left, and almost all of the passengers weren't allowed to disembark in Cuba. Many of them were cabling FDR in the State Department. Can we come? We can see the lights of Miami off the coast. Will you let us dock? And the answer was, you need to wait your turn in line. There are many people ahead of you who applied long ago from Germany and Austria, and it's not your turn, and we can't bump those people off the list. That ship went back to Europe, and over 250 of the passengers were eventually killed when the Nazis expanded throughout Western Europe. So this mentality of we don't want refugees, we're not going to change our laws to accommodate them, sadly, it's not new. We do, however, have some legal obligations that did not exist at the time of the USS St. Louis. We are signatories to the United Nations Refugee Convention and its protocol. We are signatories to the Convention Against Torture. We made the Refugee Act into domestic law in 1980 when we passed the Refugee Act. So those are our legal obligations. As I had the picture in the sign here, we have the Statue of Liberty, which I think many of us look to as an indication that our social norms and our cultural norms really expect us to welcome the huddled masses yearning to be free. So what's the current climate like for people seeking protection in the United States? There currently is a refugee crisis in this hemisphere, and it's not often talked about. The Obama administration declined to call what's happening in Central America a refugee crisis. I don't think President Trump has even mentioned the Central America refugee problem. What's happening is that in El Salvador, Guatemala, and Honduras, you have governments that are corrupted by the gangs. You have police forces and military that are caving to the influence of the organized gangs. And you have teenagers and families who are being forcibly recruited to join the gangs or extorted by the gangs to pay rent or be allowed to operate their businesses. Hundreds of thousands of families have come to the United States over the past few years fleeing for their lives. And they have been met with jail cells on our southern border. This picture on the left here is from a family detention facility. There's a crib you can see in a jail cell, along with a bunk bed and an open toilet. We've actually, under President Obama, started building family detention facilities that are used to hold mothers and infants, toddlers, and teenagers. Once a child turns, I think it's 16, they're separated and sent to a juvenile facility. But the courts have upheld this practice of family detention temporarily. However, there was an article that went around a couple weeks ago about a woman from Afghanistan who had been in one of these family detention facilities for 6 months while her claim was going through the immigration court process. She tried to commit suicide, and when they asked her why, she said she thought if she was gone, her children would be free, that they would no longer be held in one of these facilities. So this is a situation that a lot of Americans don't know is happening, that is being done as a way to deter Central Americans from showing up at our border and asking for asylum. The second humanitarian issue that is front and center is President Trump's executive order barring refugee arrivals. It's often referred to as the travel ban or the Muslim ban. There's a handout on your table that is a timeline we put together from January 27th, when President Trump announced this ban, to last week when I was frantically updating my outline as the Supreme Court was making changes to the ban. So initially, the executive order would ban arrivals from 7 Muslim majority countries, and it also included a ban for 120 days on all refugee arrivals. It initially barred Syrian refugees forever from arriving in the United States. And it dropped the annual number of refugees that the administration would accept from 110,000, which was set by Obama for the current fiscal year, down to 50. The courts have been very active in hearing litigation, a number of claims brought by the ACLU, in fact, challenging this as a discriminatory bar that was targeted towards Muslims. And currently, the Supreme Court has reversed course and allowed this ban to go into effect temporarily until they hear arguments in October. Now, they have made one exception that the ban will not impact anyone who has a bona fide relationship to a person or an entity in the United States. And there's a lot of haggling about what does that mean. It seems that it means grandparents and aunts and uncles and mother-in-laws. It's not clear what that means for refugees who have been invited to come by a refugee resettlement agency. So for example, where I used to work, the Lutheran Immigration Refugee Service, we resettled thousands and thousands of refugees each year, and we would have an agreement with that person. We're going to take you to Vermont. Burlington, Vermont is going to resettle you. We'll take care of you for a limited amount of time, and then you'll be self-sufficient. That relationship is still a question mark, whether that's bona fide or not, and that's one thing that the Supreme Court will be hearing when it takes up that case in October. I want to leave time for questions, but I also want to end on a bright spot, which is that as states were grappling with the question of Syrian refugees over the past few years, almost all Republican governors said, my state is no longer interested in accepting Syrian refugees. We're going to try to pass a law that says no Syrians allowed here, or we're going to end our state resettlement program in hopes that no Syrians come here. The one Republican governor who stood up and spoke out for Syrian refugees was Governor Herbert, the only Republican governor. So, on that happy note, I'm happy to take questions.
You know, every problem has a genesis, and I think you identified a good part of the genesis. However, you skipped over a part that occurred during Reagan's administration, when he rescinded the deportation of many of our economic problems relative to the wine industry, which now becomes a precedent of how do you get rid of all of our, say, 40% undocumented labor people. So the question is, how do we adjust ourselves to keeping an economic balance and still allow them some kind of citizenship,
right?
Whether we do it on a 5-year basis or whatever. And I see no attention being brought to that.
That's a really good question. So there've been attempts over the years to kind of reset our immigration system. Reagan had a big one there. It's called amnesty. You know, a Republican president passing an amnesty. It's kind of hard to imagine that happening now. And a few million individuals, mostly from Central America, were allowed to stay here and kind of wipe their immigration past clean and start over. The only enforcement mechanism it created was that piece of paper, the I-9, that you have to fill out when you're hired. And theoretically, someone comes along every so often and audits that and makes sure that everyone is authorized to work. That rarely happens. It's all on paper. It's just not a very modern way to approach the problem. Some of the answers that have been talked about, and as Russ mentioned, my time in the trenches trying to pass immigration reform in DC, had to do with more, let's start now. We'll look at how do we hand out visas going forward, or how do we work with industry to make this more of an American workforce with some help from immigrant labor. Like, how do we prioritize American citizens with the reality that there aren't enough Americans to pick the grapes in the vineyards or harvest the onions in Alabama or whatever. We just need to try to modernize our system so that it can accommodate all the different segments. And I love the banner up here about the 4-way test. And I think these are all good questions that I wish legislators would consider when coming up with an immigration solution. They often don't even make it to the first one. And part of the problem is that you have so many people lobbying them. You have, as I mentioned, you have Google, you have the farm workers, but then you have some very, very anti-immigrant groups throwing just made up numbers out there and really distorting the argument. So it's almost a microcosm of what we see in all of politics today. There's so much emotion around the immigration system. It's tied to our economy, it's tied to our families, it's tied to our identity. who are we as Americans? Are we going to turn away the USS St Louis again in the form of Syrian refugees not being allowed to come? So I think all of these questions bring up just so much that it sadly has been paralyzed.
As a technology entrepreneur in the state of Utah, I oftentimes work building my small business and software business, work with outsourcing my technology needs and development needs out of the country to cheaper options like in India and Philippines. Going back to HB1 visa for foreign immigrants that come and work in the technology sector, I'd like to hear your standpoint of what that looks like. What's the debate looking like now?
Yeah.
Is that going to be ongoing? Is it going to allow me to bring in Indian immigrants to work in my office here in Salt Lake City?
Right.
Or do I need to keep going outsourcing overseas?
So I'm definitely not an H-1B visa.
Question for those of us who aren't.
Okay, so the question is about, there's a certain highly skilled visa, the H-1B visa, that tends to be used up for a lot of technology needs. So the question is, what's that debate looking like now? Is there going to be a way for businesses to hire people to come over from India or the Philippines and do that work here on site? Or do companies need to plan on continuing to outsource their work to other countries that have that talent pool? It is such a complicated field. I'm not an employment expert at all, but I do know that H-1B visas, the day that they're available every year, they fill out. Clearly, the system that we have now is not working. It's not adapting to the growth. It's not allowing us to be competitive with nations like India and China, where some of those people want to come here and work in the United States and have their own ideas for startup companies, but they can't do it because they can't get the visas. There's some crazy statistics out of Silicon Valley about the percentage of startup companies that are begun by immigrants. And you look at Steve Jobs, his father was Iranian. You look at the CEOs of most of the large tech companies in Silicon Valley, and they're either started by immigrants, run by immigrants, or the majority of the workforce is immigrants. So it's one of those questions where you have the debate about, well, shouldn't we be hiring more Americans, or should we be allowing more foreigners to bring their talent here to contribute to America?
To address that, having been through the hiring process, I can tell you the talent pool is very different. So STEM jobs they're lacking here locally, not only in Utah but throughout the United States. So it's very hard to find a really highly skilled software developer where you can find one for $30 an hour as opposed to $150 an hour in India, who is actually quite skilled.
Right.
And so that's the real difficulty. And so I'm wondering, where are we in those debates currently now to bring them here? Is it still just kind of stagnant?
My sense is that all of the questions about immigration, people have tried for so many years, so passionately to resolve them and gotten nowhere, that people are back at the drawing board right now trying to figure out, okay, with this Congress and this president, what's possible?
I have a crazy question, but I'd love your take.
Okay.
There are a few people that are thoughtful, like Connor Boyack, rather famously in Utah. You know Connor, I'm sure. He's argued for no limitation on immigration at all. No one takes that seriously, but why shouldn't we think more seriously about that?
And that kind of position is derogatorily referred to as open borders by people on the other side of the debate who would want to lock down our borders. And you know, we essentially were an open border country until the 1920s. And if you look at the border of Texas and Mexico, it's just arbitrary. You talk to Native Americans or Mexican Americans who've lived in that part of the country for 300 years, and they'll tell you that the border crossed them, that they were Mexican or they were Navajo, and suddenly now they're on the Texas side of the border. So the question of borders, to get really academic for a minute, that's one that may be changing in our lifetimes. We've seen it with the EU, whether that's going to stay or not is an open question, but their system of borders is basically outside the EU now, and you can come and go as you want if you're a member of the EU. So that concept is something that maybe isn't as crazy as it sounds. And I think if you talk about the US-Canada border, you get a much different reaction when you talk about open borders than if you're talking about the US-Mexico border. So there's a lot of probably biases and history that plays into which borders we choose to militarize. One more question.
In the narrow group of asylum seekers, why does it take so long for them to get the permission to work while they're here before their status is determined?
Right. So did everyone hear that question? Should I repeat it? So the question is for asylum seekers who are here, who raise their hand and say, I need protection. There's a very long process that you go through. First, you have an interview with the asylum office, and if that's not successful, you go to court, you have a full-blown trial to adjudicate your claim, and that can take years. So it's a narrow question, and the answer is our immigration courts are woefully underfunded and understaffed. And the backlog now is something like 4 years to get a trial date. So it's not just asylum seekers, it's anyone who is facing deportation. They, every year Congress passes more and more appropriations for enforcement. So I just mentioned that arrests are up 40%. They don't increase the number or the staffs of the immigration courts. So you're funneling more and more people into the same adjudication process. And then you're wondering, wow, why do these backlogs keep getting longer? It comes down to really a question of appropriations. And again, if you have a lot of people who are pro se because they can't afford counsel, they're up there trying to work their way through the immigration laws and trying to represent themselves, trying to maybe scrape together money to hire a lawyer, and they might ask for 4 or 5 continuances until they're ready to go forward with their case. So the immigration courts it's a system that needs a lot of work. There's a really sad expose last summer about children who are going in front of immigration courts unrepresented, and you have a 10-year-old up there expected to argue for herself. And some of the immigration judges were saying, I in good conscience, I can't do this. And they were starting to lobby Congress to appoint attorneys for children who find themselves unrepresented before the immigration court. Sorry, I'm such a downer. I feel like whenever I talk, all I do is like share sad stories and even built in ending on a happy note at one point. So sorry I couldn't do that.
Very important perspective to a complex problem. We don't feel down. Thank you for being here. She has signed our book that we will donate to the library at Franklin Elementary School. Green is a Chili Pepper, a book of colors. And a reminder that next week it's going to be August. Can you believe it? August 1st, a week from today. And we will be at the Joseph Smith Memorial Building hearing from Elliot Fall from the Harriman Soccer Academy. So please join us next week, and we are adjourned.